Hello, welcome.
Lecture 3, Sparta, Perceptions and Prejudices.
In this lecture, I'm going to introduce Sparta, one of the two great belligerents in the Peloponnesian War, and this is one of two lectures that will explain Spartan institutions and the Peloponnesian League. And it'll be mashed by two lectures dealing with Athens and the Athenian Navy. So you'll have a context of what these powers are like, so we just don't rush into the war without an understanding of the traditions and institutions of the two principal belligerents. Sparta, as I mentioned, is a society and a constitution that has inspired interest since antiquity. It has been admired. It was admired by most Greek authors who thought that Sparta was a eunomia, that is well ordered, well governed by proper law. And really, most ancient authors despaired of Athens as a radical democracy that destroyed the rule of the best, and that the reputation the Athenian democracy has enjoyed in the more modern age was certainly not one shared by most ancient authors. There are two reasons for that, and that is the Athenians lost the Peloponnesian War, and they had the audacity to put on trial and execute Socrates, which gained them the enmity of Plato, no small matter. But the Spartans, on the other hand, have very good press. Yet, the Spartans themselves do not write about their constitution, and that adds an additional problem. Because most authors who came to write on Sparta generally wrote from a moralizing view. And they fall in two classes. One of them is those authors who thought Sparta was a wonderful constitution, the model to be used to order your own state, and they tended to idealize Sparta as an unchanging world in which these institutions go back to their legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, who may have lived in the 8th century BC. And Lycurgus is invoked with about as much accuracy as most Americans today invoke the founding fathers, and though pressed who they were and what they did, they're a little vague on the details. The second type of authors are authors who praise Sparta the way they had been and deplore the Spartan conditions of their own day, that the Spartans had fallen due to lack of morality, they've been corrupted by money. And they too have a very idealized image of the past. And being non-Spartans, all of these authors in effect build up a Spartan mirage, as it's sometimes called in the literature. This is what Sparta was really like, and we should really imitate it or see how far they have fallen from their forefathers. So when you're dealing with the ancient sources on Sparta, you run into this problem that you have this very, very strange image of it, which is not an accurate historical image, or even an attempt at such, written by an author who is a native Spartan, or at least very sympathetic and understanding of Spartan institutions, the way we have in Roman history, the way we have in Athenian history. So that is the first warning. A second point that's very important to be made for modern scholars is Sparta does not provide us the kind of archaeology and information that we get from other Greek city-states. They remain very conservative in their organization. That does not mean they were impoverished. But a warning that is said by Thucydides early in his history should be scholars should pay more attention to it. Thucydides' writing in the Peloponnesian War makes the following comment. Suppose, for example, that the city of Sparta were to become deserted and that only the temples and foundations of buildings remained. I think that future generations, as time passed, find it very difficult to believe that the place had really been as powerful as it was represented to be. Yet the Spartans occupied 2/5 of the Peloponnesus. That's the southern peninsula of Greece, that three-pronged peninsula attached by the Isthmus of Corinth. And they stand at the head not only of the whole Peloponnesus itself, but also of numerous allies beyond the frontiers.
That's right.
Since, however, the city is not regularly planned and contains no temples or monuments of great magnificence, but is simply a collection of villages, these are known as obi in the Spartan political organization, there are 5 of them, in the ancient Hellenic way, its appearance would not come up to expectation. If, on the other hand, the same thing were to happen to Athens, one would conjecture from what met the eye that the city had been twice as powerful as, in fact, it is. A very, very astute remark by Thucydides, himself an Athenian, who did appreciate the power that the Spartans had. And that is an important warning in looking at the Spartan sources, and our principal sources come from well after the Peloponnesian War, or before. Herodotus, the father of history, writing in the mid-5th century BC, probably gives us our most unprejudiced information, and he himself has to explain Sparta in a way, and almost an anthropologist has to. The Spartans are unusual. They still have kings, two of them, from two different independent royal lines. Whereas other Greek city-states have gotten rid of the kingship long ago, they have institutions religious that are unusual. They're Greek, but they're variations of it. And Herodotus goes through a great deal of extent in his history describing Sparta almost the way he would describe Persia or Egypt to his Greek audience. And we get very good information there. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, reports on the Spartan constitution. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, follows up with later information. And again, we have an enormous amount of information from one of the most delightful writers of antiquity, Plutarch, a really nice person. You would love to invite Plutarch to a dinner party because there's great anecdotes. But Plutarch writes on philosophical and moral issues, and he's preserved biographies of certain Spartan kings, the lawgiver Lycurgus, Lysander, who wins the Peloponnesian War, King Agesilaus, and these reforming kings of the 3rd century BC, as well as lots of sayings about the Spartans.
I'll use that with
Finally,
one.
we have
Just
a very, very strange
win
work
without it.
under the guise of the historian Xenophon, who's an Athenian who writes about the later stages of the Peloponnesian War and after, which talks about the Spartan constitution and falls in that second classic genre of see how noble the Spartans were and how far they had fallen. So all of this information together is often used by scholars as well as other sources to piece together this single image of Sparta. And the problem with it is that Sparta evolved, as all Greek city-states, that the information comes from different times and different places, that the archaeology is limited in comparison to other Greek city-states, and above all, the Spartans contributed to the mirage. The Spartans were far, far more clever than generally credited. They liked to put out the image that they were, gee shucks, we're from Laconia, that's the reason. We're just not as clever as the Athenians. This was a pose. This was often a diplomatic pose to take their enemy by surprise. And the Spartans really turn out to be far more clever in diplomatic procedures and in negotiations than they're usually credited, and they build up this image that they are a simple foe. So, with all of that in mind, let me give you a sketch of what the Spartan constitution was like by the time of the Peloponnesian War, and what those institutions were like that trained Spartans to a level of civic virtue that was admired by all other Greek cities. And there is no doubt from the evidence in classical antiquity that Sparta was regarded as, in many ways, the city that produced the model citizens, men and women both, devoted to the traditions of the polis, and was also a city well noted for its choral poetry, for its ceramics, and for other decorative arts, although not the type of monumental buildings, not the type of architecture and art that would come to characterize Athens and then later cities. Well, the Spartans themselves occupy a region known as Laconia, and Sparta is this collection of essentially 5 villages in the middle of the Eurotas Valley. The main river that flows through Laconia. It rises in the mountains and flows into the Aegean Sea. And those Spartans are speakers of the Dorian dialect of Greek. And the Greek language is divided into a series of dialects. There's 3 great classifications. Ionian, or East Greek, in which the Athenians and their kinsmen in Asia Minor and the islands fall. Dorian, which is a set of languages largely spoken in the Peloponnesus and Crete. Aeolian, which is a set of dialects spoken in central Greece. These linguistic divisions go back to the end of the Bronze Age, the end of the Iron Age, when the first Greek civilizations collapsed. The civilizations remembered in the heroic traditions from 1600 to 1200 BC, and there was a migration of Dorian speakers into the Peloponnesus, which changed the linguistic dialect of Greece. The Spartans were descended from Dorians. They had arrived in that valley sometime in the 11th century BC. They subjugated the older populations in what is often called the Dark Age period. And by 800 BC, they had consolidated into a city-state, a polis. And as in that passage of Thucydides, they never built walls, they never had the same public monuments, but they had the political institutions of a polis. They remembered themselves as 5 distinct villages that came together. They also retained 2 royal dynasties. These kings were essentially hereditary military commanders and priests. And they ruled far more by influence than by dictate. And the fact that there were two families, the senior Agiad and the junior Eurypontid line, meant that the two kings were usually at each other's throats, trying to outdo each other. And furthermore, the kings as a political force in Sparta really depended very much on their personality and charisma rather than any kind of powers they had. They didn't have the means to set up a bureaucracy or officials. Instead, the government of Sparta looked very much like many governments in the Greek world, and that is it would be characterized as an oligarchy or ruled by the landed classes. There was a council, a Gerousia, of 28 members voted by acclaim from the citizen body who met with the kings, and that council, it's characteristic in all Greek city-states to have a council, that acted as a sort of standing committee that could act in the name of the Spartans and would summon the assembly of citizens when big issues had to be decided. The third component, besides the kings and the Gerousia, and remember the kings are on the Gerousia, the council itself, so it's a total of 30 members. The assembly was ultimately the sovereign body that passed laws. And this is true in most Greek cities. The question of the nature of the constitution was not the fact that you had elected officials, council, assembly, it's who had citizenship to vote in this. How restricted was the franchise? And in Sparta, we shall see, it was fairly restricted. The men who went into that assembly were 30 years and above. They were full Spartans by descent. They had gone through a common training program. They shared a set of assumptions and ideas. They may have numbered between 5,000 and 10,000 adult males of military age, if that. And in some instances, people would argue as low as 3,000. But nonetheless, the assembly is passed the laws. There are no checks and balances as we understand it in the American Constitution. In any case, the system had evolved over the course of the 8th and 7th century BC, and the Spartans had devised a second, or an additional component. They had a board of 5 ephors. These were overseers, 5 men elected annually from the citizen body, probably from prominent families, and their job was to handle the instruction and supervise the training of young Spartans and the whole moral and religious life. Some scholars have attempted to turn these ephors into essentially foreign ministers, that is, a changing board that had 5 members who were elected and essentially dictated foreign policy and presented foreign policy to the assembly and devised treaties because there are reports of ephors at times meeting with foreigners. There's no evidence for this. Instead, the sources, particularly Thucydides, presents a very traditional society in which the kings, meeting with the Gerousia, and the 5 ephors, usually called the authorities, or those in charge, ta tele ton lacedaemonion, would meet and probably reached a consensus without a vote. They talked, they debated, they came to a position, then they would go to the assembly and present the position to the assembly, and the assembly would deliberate and choose. Spartans only voted when there was really an issue, as in 432 BC. You're dealing with a traditional society with a very homogeneous population, and most people understand what the rules are. And they're very deferential to authority and tradition. And so, contrary to what many recent publications have argued, that Spartan foreign policy was erratic, the emperors were always changing, you never knew when they were, who was going to do what policy, really Spartan policy was probably quite consistent. The Spartans were persuaded and reached opinions often without actually going to a full vote. Very different from the Athenians. The Athenians love debate. They love a knocked-out, dragged-out debate, and they vote. They always want to vote. So in that sense, you're dealing with 2 variations of the city-state. The second important point about this constitution is that the Spartans ruled a wide area beyond the city of Sparta proper. And that is the region of Laconia, which is today southeastern Peloponnesus, and the region immediately to the west known as Messenia. Messenia was conquered in 2 major wars, traditionally dated from 736 to 716, and then again from 668 to 657 BC. And what the Spartans had done is first bring Laconia under control, and then in a series of 2 wars, brought Messenia under Spartan control. And the populations in these regions were divided into different classifications. One major classification were perioiki, a word that means dwellers around. This is found in many other Greek city-states. These were free populations living in communities that lived under their own laws. They were not Spartan citizens, but owed military service to Sparta,
Sure.
and were summoned out and drilled and led by Spartan officers in battle, and in time were brigaded with Spartan citizens. How many of them they are is difficult to.
I need to eat and exercise a bit, so I'll see you a bit later.